Today on the Leadership Standard, we welcome an award-winning thinker, author, broadcaster, and speaker on some of today's most significant trends in business. Longtime senior editor-at-large and columnist for Fortune magazine, he's become one of the world's sharpest, most respected commentators on leadership, globalization, wealth creation, the infotech revolution, and much, much more. As a speaker, he's engaged hundreds of audiences around the world, ranging in size from 10 to 10,000. He's analyzed companies and business leaders worldwide as they confront the largest issues of our time and what distinguishes the greats from everybody else. His newest book, now available, is Humans Are Underrated: What High Achievers Know That Brilliant Machines Never Will. And throughout his work, Geoff Colvin proves that to a far greater degree than any of us could possibly imagine, we already have within us what it takes to be great. Geoff Colvin, welcome to the Leadership Standard.
Thank you very much, Gair.
So as we welcome you, Geoff, to the Leadership Standard, and given your long-term affiliation with Fortune magazine, I think a lot of people would be fascinated to know what goes into, what's happening behind the scenes that allows a company, for example, to get on that Fortune 500 list. Can you shed any light for anyone listening right now as to what does it take to get on that coveted list?
Absolutely, and it's a great question, Gair. Well, first of all, the simple technical answer is the cutoff for number 500 on the US 500, it's annual revenues of 5 or 6 billion. For the global 500, the cutoff is about 13 billion. The Fortune 500 is always ranked according to revenues, but that's just the technical answer, right? That doesn't really tell you what it takes to get in there. What I've observed over the years is that the companies that do it tend to be ones that think further ahead in their strategizing, that think larger in their strategizing. Here's an example, and it encapsulates a few things. One of the most famous corporate failures in forever is Kodak, because it was so clearly displaced by digital technology. And so people say, well, gee, how couldn't they adapt? How could they have failed to adapt to the digital revolution? But if you think about that question, the answer really is they couldn't have adapted to the digital revolution. They were in the chemical photography business for the mass market, and it was fabulously profitable. They made huge amounts of money for over 100 years doing this. Okay, well, so you say it goes digital, which it has done. Who can you think of who's making a lot of money in mass market digital photography today? The answer, I think, is nobody. Digital photography for the mass market today is nothing more than a feature on your phone. There isn't any film or any paper or any processing or anything like that. And for that matter, it's just a feature on your phone, and you don't even know who made that lens. I don't know. You don't know who made any of the stuff in there. The truth is, if Kodak wanted to survive, it would have had to change into a completely different business. And the great contrast here is that in the same year that Kodak went bankrupt, Facebook bought Instagram when it had 12 employees for $1 billion. Instagram was the future of mass market consumer photography because it was about sharing photographs. That's what mass market photography has always been about. It was about sharing photographs, which people could do digitally online. And so Instagram is the company that was the real successor to Kodak. But Kodak would never have recognized that as a business at all. So back to your real question, what does it take to be a Fortune 500 company? It's thinking like Instagram and not like Kodak. It's thinking enough steps ahead that you can see where this is going to go. And even if it's completely different, you've got to be able to accept and then embrace that reality.
There's been a lot written, Geoff, as you know, about, and I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but it was something like, let's say in 1955, whatever the Fortune 500 list, 40, 50 years later, something like 83% were off that list. I think what you've opened the door to is that how accurate of a barometer is that Fortune 500 list to where the future is going?
Yeah, well, you're, by the way, congratulations, you were right. 1955 is correct. And that's when it started. And you're right. The vast majority of the companies that were on that list are not on it anymore. And what it shows you is the shifting landscape, is how business is shifting. And so, I think it's really interesting. And by the way, you could do this at fortune.com. You can go and look at the list from 1955. And, the top 10 included companies like, I think, United States Leather Company or something like that. There was a meat processor in the top 10. It's real value is enabling you to reflect on why those companies aren't there anymore. And of course, what you see now, and this is really striking, a couple of things. First of all, in the top 10, several of them are, of course, digital companies. Companies that didn't exist. And in fact, in some cases, the founders hadn't even been born in 1955. Another really interesting fact, and this surprises people, the category, the industry with the most companies in the top 10 is healthcare. 4 of the top 10 companies are healthcare companies. They're mostly not consumer companies. And so people don't recognize the names. Cardinal Health or McKesson, these are wholesalers in the business. But that's where things are going. The economy is increasingly based on healthcare. And it's a trend that you can see just by looking at the top of the 500.
I have to ask you, because of this thread, this conversational thread about the future. And I don't say this, I don't want to embarrass you, but you're on stages fairly frequently with people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett and Richard Branson. And now we got Bezos and Branson going into space. I'm just trying to paint a picture for our listeners and viewers, Geoff. You're around like multi-billionaire visionaries. What do you see in terms of what they see? I think people would be fascinated to know how they think and how they project out for decades, in terms of your perspective.
Yeah. First of all, they are always really living in the future. That's so incredibly important to them. Well, when Bezos now has stepped down as CEO of Amazon, but when he was CEO, he believed his job was to be living always 2 years in the future. He had managers who could manage the present for him. He had to be thinking 2 years in the future. I'm remembering also Bill Gates, 30 years ago, talking about things that we are only beginning to see happening now, but he could see them happening back then. He knew where this was going to end up. He could see the steps. And I'm talking now about entrepreneurs. It's easier for them because, especially early in their careers, they aren't, as it were, burdened by existing assets and existing overhead in all kinds of business, and frankly, existing success in businesses that they are in. those all turn out to be real big problems for companies trying to stay competitive and continue to prosper. So that's the one thing. They're always living in the future. Another thing I've noticed is that they just have tremendous courage. This sounds so elemental, but the more I learn and the more I talk to people and observe this whole business world, the more convinced I am that courage is really the fundamental virtue. Aristotle said it was the greatest virtue, the one that made all other virtues possible. And in business, as in life, I think that that really is true. They are willing to make decisions without all the information they need, because you will never have all the information you need. They are willing to make decisions that embody a lot of courage. They believe it's going to work okay, but they cannot know for sure that it will. And they do it anyway. And that has characterized the greats.
Well, that's such a fascinating observation, because it segues into one of the things I think it's become one of the real hot topics, Geoff. And one of your books, you've written a number of bestsellers, but I want to explore this idea from the workplace of the future. If business leaders now have very little to go on, well, what's the workplace of the future really going to look like post-pandemic? You wrote a book called Humans Are Underrated, What High Achievers Know That Brilliant Machines Never Will. There's all this talk about AI. There's all this talk, Geoff, about work from home programs. There's just a mass of confusion right now. What do you see into your crystal ball in terms of where this is all going?
Well, what I see is the importance of physical presence becoming even more appreciated and understood as we go through this. After we've had these many, many months of so many office workers working from home, and now haltingly, companies trying to get people back into the office and deciding who needs to be in the office and how often and who doesn't need to be and so forth. What we're going to discover, and some companies I think already know it, and some people are figuring it, some companies are figuring it out, is the amazing power of physical presence, because it's hardwired in us as human beings. And there's quite a lot about this in the book. The fact is that we are social animals. We evolved in groups. That's the only way we survived 200,000 years ago. You know, if we were in a group, we survived. If we were alone, we died. We had to be in groups, and all kinds of things happen when we are physically together, looking at each other in person, face to face. It's like magic almost, but when we are looking at each other in person, face to face, the pupils of our eyes dilate and constrict in response to one another. We're not consciously aware that it's happening, but it's happening. And deep in our brains, trust is building. We unconsciously mimic one another's postures when we're talking to each other. We mimic one another's tone of voice. We even mimic one another's accents as we speak to each other. And this also builds trust without our even being aware of it. And trust is obviously at the foundation of business. It's also at the foundation of creativity and innovation. Creativity works best with groups, not individuals, and it does not happen without trust. And nothing, this is, the researchers have found this. There is no substitute, they said, for physical presence in building this trust. So as we figure out, as you say, the workplace of the future, we are going to come to a new appreciation of the value, tremendous value, of being physically together and when we really need that.
So what does that look like practically speaking? And I know one of the things you bring to your keynote presentations and the work that you do, Geoff, is this background of serious experience for serious times. Practically speaking, for anyone in any category, when they're talking about, 100-person company, let's say, um, there's this talk about, is it going to be a hybrid model? How's it going to play out, do you think? And what do leaders need to know? Because I think they know that nothing beats in person, but practically, how's that going to play out? Because it's not going back to the way it was. I think we can feel that.
You're so right. I mean, we never go all the way back to the way things were, and we're not going to do it this time. So there are a couple interesting things going on. One, a lot of people, a lot of leaders do know that, physical presence is extremely valuable. The question is, how much is really needed to get the benefits? So do you need people in the office 5 days a week? Is 3 days good enough? Is once a week good enough for getting people together? That has to be figured out. And we see a lot of experiments going on, and we'll have it, worked out in the next year. That's all going to have to be orchestrated. And they're the real nuts and bolts. If you tell people you have to be here 3 days a week, well, then they're all going to be there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and the office will be empty on Monday and Friday. But you're still paying for all that space because everybody's going to be there on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So they have to get all of that figured out, and they're doing it. But there's another element at work here that I don't think has been sufficiently pursued lately, or enough thought about today, which is the role of ambition. I'm going to say reasonably, let's assume that at a lot of companies, not all, but at a lot of companies, the CEO is going to be coming in 5 days a week. Okay. If that's right, then I'm guessing the CEO's direct reports are going to be coming in 5 days a week, right? And then the people who report to them, at least those who want to rise higher, are probably going to be coming in that much also. Emulation of the boss is a very well-established phenomenon in business, right? Well, what's going to happen is the workforce, the employees in a company, are going to sort themselves into two groups: those who want to rise higher and those who don't really. They're content to do their job, not looking for a lot of advancement or a lot of big raises, but that's okay for them. They're fine. And employees have always sorted themselves into those two groups. The difference now is that the first group is going to be in the office as often as possible. And the second group, at least much of it, is going to be in the office as seldom as possible. And so there's going to be a real difference between them. And is that going to be okay? Is that going to cause problems? We don't know, but we're going to have to deal with it.
Another concept that leaders are going to have to deal with is something that surfaced actually at a Tech Canada meeting just over a year ago. It was in Kelowna, British Columbia, where this concept of reputational equity came from. And then you and I actually had a conversation about it as well, about the role of business leaders. I'd love for you to expand on it from our conversation nearly a year ago. Speak to us, Geoff, about the role that business leadership now has to play and be aware of in terms of building their online awareness, their brand reputation, if you will.
Yeah. There's a lot going on there, and a couple things that are kind of eternal but still get forgotten, and then a couple things that really are not eternal that are more new. In building a brand, the most valuable framework that I've found, and I certainly didn't originate it, but the most useful framework that I've found is that brand strength doesn't come from what most of us, if we're amateurs at marketing, would think of. It isn't I want people to know my brand and like my brand. There's nothing wrong with that. Those are great things. But if you want a strong brand, the two criteria that are most important by far are differentiation and relevance. And it takes both of them. Clear differentiation and clear relevance. So for example, you could say that, Rolls-Royce automobiles are highly differentiated, but they're not relevant to 99.99% of the population. On the other hand, you could say the drugstore chains are highly relevant to everybody. We're all in those stores all the time, but typically they're not differentiated. You walk through the front door and you can't tell which one you're in, right? So it takes both. And if you think of the strongest brands you can think of, Apple, Disney, they're highly differentiated. There's nothing like either one of them. And they're highly relevant to the lives of millions or even billions of people. That's the kind of eternal wisdom. The other side of this that is more new and that business leaders really are going to struggle with, they are doing so already, is this question of when do they speak up? We've seen them speaking up on social issues, even political issues in recent months, last few years actually, when this never used to be done. It was a clear loser, right? You would never talk about that because you'd be guaranteed to make angry half of your customers. And why would you ever want to do that? And yet we see CEOs doing it now, and they are doing it because, in large part, because of the employees. The employees want to hear, what does my employer stand for? And it's a slippery slope and it's dangerous because there are some employees who probably won't agree with what the CEO says. And so in a way, but I should say, if they don't speak up at all, there are some employees who are going to be very disappointed. And so it's kind of a no-win situation. And yet many CEOs are deciding that they have to speak up on some of these social and political issues. And it's not an easy decision. And all I say to these people ultimately is, you know what? It's a complicated world and you get paid a lot to deal with it. So, deal with it.
That's, and that's one of the things it's interesting because it did surface at a Tech Canada meeting, which, Tech Canada is our nation's largest CEO peer advisory group. You were telling us before that peer advisories and mentorship was a huge part of the success of Fortune magazine. I think people would be really interested to know, because in this complicated world that you spoke of, I think it really helps to be surrounded by other voices and other perspectives that can see the things you can't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, what I was referring to with regard to Fortune really just had to do with the internal organization of Fortune magazine. And I've worked there for a very long time. And so I can tell you that, when I started there, it had a very well-developed system of mentoring and coaching younger employees. It operated in a way like no other magazine or newspaper or journalistic organization anywhere else. It was unique. So for example, when a writer was writing a Fortune article, that writer would have assigned to him or her someone who was called a researcher. That's how I started. That was the entry-level position. And the researcher accompanied the writer on all the interviews, often set up the interviews, did a lot of the research and fact-checking and so forth. But in the interviews, the researcher is the one who took all the notes. I think Fortune writers were the only writers in journalism who didn't take their own notes. They had somebody, like me, whose job was to sit there and take the notes. But the value was, here, you're a kid. You get to see how a Fortune writer interacts with the CEO of a big famous company. Otherwise, I would have no idea. So you learned every time how this was done. And then the Fortune editors, once you were writing stuff for yourself, the Fortune editors took tremendous care and time with the draft that you turned in and explained to you what needed doing and why. It was an expensive system. I'll tell you, it was an expensive system. We did virtually all interviews in person. A writer and reporter would fly to Chicago to do 2 interviews. It was an expensive system, but man, was it effective at developing all the people who had to do the editorial work at the magazine.
That's a fascinating story because it speaks to a certain level of leadership. Here on the leadership standard, Geoff, as you can appreciate, we will never run out of topics to explore the concept of leadership. Let's ask you, given your vast amount of experience and serious experience, how would you define leadership?
Well, it's a hard question. It's a hard question because it's such a large question. There are so many things people have said that I agree with. You will sometimes hear it said that a leader's job is to define reality and give hope. To define reality, meaning taking the whole environment that our organization is in and being able to present it in such a way that it's a coherent whole. There's a way to understand it. And then to say, this is our reality and we have a great future because I can see where we go from this reality and it's fantastic. It's going to be wonderful. Follow me. When people get that message, they really respond to it very well. By the way, you will sometimes see that sentence, a leader's job is to define reality and give hope. You may see that attributed to Napoleon. As far as I can tell, he did not say that. I actually did a lot of research on this. This is because I was trained as a researcher, right? So I actually tried to find out, and I spoke to leading Napoleon scholars in Paris. They said, I never heard of it. I don't think he said it. Anyway, but it's still a good line. It's still a very good definition. The related thing I would say about it as advice to leaders is remember that people want to be led. Everyone understands, we all understand in our bones that no organization achieves anything very worthwhile without leadership. And people are looking for it. People want to be led. And the reason I emphasize this is to tell people in leadership roles, if you're in charge, be in charge. Okay. There's a time for discussion, obviously. There's a time for consensus. But ultimately, if you're in charge, be in charge. People want to be led.
I can't help but think that in the photograph behind me, which you will recognize instantly, there were leadership lessons that a young Geoff Colvin picked up in the town of Vermilion, South Dakota. Population, what, about 10,000?
Yeah, it is now. It was smaller when I lived there.
Yeah, when you think back to the early days of a young Geoff Colvin, before he goes on to New York and Fortune magazine and sharing stages with some of the greatest business leaders in history, what would have been an early leadership lesson that you still carry forward from Vermilion, South Dakota to this day?
Yeah, it was a great place to grow up. I have to say, with every passing year, I appreciate it more. It was a great, great place to grow up. what strikes me most memorably about the leadership topic is that leadership was practiced in a very low-key way. It wasn't practiced in, a table-pounding boss kind of way. It wasn't General Patton. It wasn't these huge, heroic scale leaders. It was low-key, but very clear in what was acceptable and what was not. The leaders that I remember then were very good at creating an atmosphere of expectations, right? So that just in the air you breathed, you realized that certain things were expected of you. And nobody needed to give you direct orders most of the time. Sometimes they did. But for the most part, they created a culture in which it was just clear what was expected of you. And it was incredibly effective at getting people to do what they were supposed to do, and with enthusiasm, because they weren't being ordered to do it. They weren't being told and threatened with consequences if they failed. They knew they were part of something larger.
Is there a favorite story from Vermilion, South Dakota? It could have been a teacher. It could have been a baseball coach from Little League. Some leader who forever stamped certain values on a young Geoff Colvin that you still carry forth to the world.
Yeah, I would really have to stop and try to think about, the anecdote that makes it all concrete and so forth. And at the moment, I can't think of the anecdote, but I can tell you what I think of were my teachers above all. And I was a little kid, but my teachers, above all, who were so clear in making us understand what we were supposed to do, what was good and what wasn't. And I never thought of them at the time as leaders. You think of the teacher as, the authority, but I didn't think of them as leaders, except now in retrospect, I realize that's what they were. And I feel blessed to have had great teachers. This is a little tiny town, but I had great teachers, and they managed to instill, not just in me, but into everybody, what was expected, what we were doing, why we were doing it, and they expressed their own enthusiasm for what we were doing. And that comes through maybe more strongly than anything else, right? If the leader is personally charged up, there's an authenticity in what they're doing that can't be conveyed any other way.
I have to ask you to reflect on the journey the Geoff Colvin leadership journey from the small town to the big city.
Yeah.
Multiple best-selling books. Talent is overrated. The upside of the downturn. Humans are underrated. What can you speak to, Geoff, that would help anyone understand that you can come from anywhere in this world and really make a mark?
Yeah. Well, that's certainly right. Because I came from a very small town. One thing I've noticed, actually, among CEOs is that that's fairly common. Not to say that all of them did, but a lot of them came from small places. And I do think that there's something in the, or at least there was, and I suspect still is, in the values of small places, small towns and so forth, that are, excellent, strong values that should be instilled in somebody. And beyond that, all I did was pursue things that were of interest to me in a fairly serious way. And that's what I was allowed to do as a kid in this town. I was encouraged by essentially all the adults around me. And that's what made a huge difference. I didn't think there was anything special about it at the time, because when you're a little kid, you think that your world is the world. Now, of course, I realize it's not the case. But I think every adult around me, and there were lots of them, parents, grandparents were all nearby, teachers, friends, plenty of other people, they were all encouraging. And the power of that is tremendous. And that's really a leadership lesson also.
As a best-selling author yourself, as one of the world's foremost business journalists, I think a lot of business leaders would be curious to know, what do you think about other authors, other thought leaders? Who out there now commands your respect? Who do you think is worth reading these days?
Yeah. Good question. It's always a hard question. I should say a few things. First, I've always been a Jim Collins fan, and that doesn't, that puts me in a very large group, but I do think he has done very good work. I speak to him from time to time, and it's always fascinating to talk with him. He is quite a remarkable mind. There's a consultant named Ram Charan who has written many books, including some bestsellers. He's been a good friend for many years and is unfailingly interesting, because he is through his work is working with the CEOs of the largest companies in the world all the time, all the time. And he is up to date on trends constantly. And by the way, he has new books coming out. I think he has 2 coming out this year. Always good. Who else? I could mention something that would surprise people probably, and that's a very old book called My Years with General Motors, by the man whose name will occur to me in a second.
Yes.
But he was the CEO through all of its growth years. And that book about what he did in organizing General Motors may sound like it's ancient history. Well, it was ancient history, but I can tell you that Bill Gates had that book on his nightstand for years, or so he said. He thought that it was so valuable as a guide to strategy and building a company.
As the world becomes more digital, and look at you and I right now using virtual platforms, love to hear your thoughts on the future of the written word and how leaders are readers. Will that still hold true in your estimation?
Yeah. It's a really good question, which may be surprising for me to say, because of course I'd love to say the written word will survive forever. It'll always be central to how we understand, how we convey knowledge, how we receive knowledge, and so forth. I can't say that with a lot of confidence, to tell you the truth. I read all the time. Probably you do too. Probably a lot of people watching this podcast do also. Warren Buffett has been very clear that he spends most of his day every day just reading. He says he is basically a book with legs. I mean, that's what he does all day long. So the value of it is beyond dispute, but I really wonder if it's going to continue to be the main way to receive and convey knowledge, other information, and other things. I know what my kids do, and they click on videos all the time. I almost never click on videos. I just want, it seems so inefficient to me, right? Well, they don't think that at all.
So will your kids be clicking onto this video to hear Dad?
They'd better, but yeah, sure they will. Sure they will. They'd love it, and they learn a lot from watching videos. There's a futurist, a guy named Bran Ferren, who has a long history as a computer pioneer, an infotech pioneer. He's worked for various companies. He's been a consultant to the US Defense Department and stuff. He's a really, incredibly brainy guy and a real futurist. And I remember he said to me once, a few years ago, I give reading and writing another 250 years. He thinks that by then we just won't even do it anymore. And of course, he's thinking about, brain to brain connections that are totally automated and stuff that we can't even think of. But you raise a really good point, which I never would have thought was even a good question in the past. What about the written word? I really don't know. But we've got to be adapting ourselves to the present when it is, in my view, unfortunately, but still less of an influence than it was.
Let's turn the page metaphorically, Geoff, and get a little more personal. What are you curious about right now?
I am very curious about the role of humans in the economy. Now, that's why there was a book called Humans Are Underrated, but the real issue is, what will people actually do in the economy? How will people add value in the economy as technology advances and advances at an increasing pace? Because we all have liked to tell ourselves, well, there are some things machines will never be able to do, right? And whenever somebody says that, they are eventually proven wrong. It's only a matter of time. I can show you, going way back, really smart people said machines would never be able to translate languages in any decent way. Well, now, I have Google Translate on this device, which translates between any two languages among 130 languages on the list. And the app is free. It's unbelievable. And it gets better every week because it always is learning. Smart people said computers would never play chess at a very high level because it was just too hard. Well, it was over 20 years ago that a computer beat the world's greatest chess player, Garry Kasparov at the time. Every time we say computers can't do something, we're wrong. It's only a matter of time. And so what I'm really curious about is, can that really go all the way? Will we get to the point of an indistinguishable humanoid device? And it turns out to be a really deep question, which becomes, at the moment, a question of philosophy rather than science. But if you think that everything about you, including what some people might call your spirit or your soul or your character, your mind, if you think that everything about you originates in this box here, in your brain or in your body somewhere. If that's the total essence of you, then it's only a matter of time before technologists can recreate the chemistry and the physics that are going on inside here. But if you think that you are more than one thing, that your spirit or soul or whatever is also separate from this body, and I realize this becomes a religious question for many people. I'm leaving that aside, but if that's what you think, well, then it may never be possible for technologists to fully create you. But what's it going to be? I don't know. And to me, that is one of the largest questions that we face and maybe will ever face.
It certainly underscores the importance of business leaders everywhere to be constantly thinking about what's the future going to be 2, 3, 4 years down the road. Back to a more personal question, Geoff. Elvis had Colonel Tom Parker. Geoff Colvin has Tony D'Amelio. It's basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? Now, yeah. I want you to picture Tony D'Amelio, Tony D, calls one day and says, "Hey, Geoff, Hollywood, I've got an offer here from Hollywood to do a major motion picture on your life story. Who would you select to play Geoff Colvin in your film biopic?"
Oh, Gair, that's terrible because I never have thought about that. I've never thought about that. Well, look. So, who would I choose to play that role?
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
Brad Pitt. I mean, who else would it be?
Who else would it be?
Right. If you look at me, you'd say, well, wouldn't it be Brad Pitt? Obviously, right?
Yeah. Why not? Because I think you said the leader's job is to divine reality and offer hope.
That's right.
Right.
I'm offering hope.
So, okay, more personal. What room in your house resonates with you the most?
Yeah. Well, in my house, that's clearly my library, which is also my office, which, and I'm not there right now. I should say that if I were home, that's the room in which I'd be sitting and you'd actually see some of it. But I'm not home right now. But yes, that is clearly it because it's got all my books in it. It's got all kinds of things on the wall. It's the one room that you get to make entirely your own. And I confess, I just love it.
Your favorite athlete, our researcher, Stephen Christofferson, uncovered your favorite athlete is Tiger Woods. Tell us why.
For a few reasons. One, as we talked about earlier, I do play golf, badly like most golfers, but nonetheless, I do play it and I do love the game. And so, of course, it's always been great just to watch him, and because you always know you're watching history whenever you see him. But another reason that he is my particular favorite is that he is such a great example of what I wrote about in a previous book that we haven't really talked about, a book called Talent is Overrated, meaning greatness doesn't, and this is not my opinion, this is based on a lot of research that others have done. Greatness does not come from what most people think, which is a gift. When you see somebody as great as Tiger Woods, you think that is so incredible. It can only be explained by a gift, a natural gift that he brought into this world with him. And the research says, no, it isn't. In fact, there may not be natural gifts. It comes from behaviors, certain specific behaviors that are not easy, but that are available to all of us. And the more research I did, the more I realized that Tiger was a perfect embodiment of this. He was very much like Mozart in that respect. And I then even discovered that other people had made the same observation, that Tiger Woods and Mozart are similar in many ways. He got and by the way, it went even further that someone wrote a book about him. One of his teachers, one of his golf coaches, wrote a book about him and actually said in the book that the way Tiger operated was the way that I described in the book that I had written previously. It's what the experts, the researchers call deliberate practice, which is not the same as practice as most of us understand it. It's a very specifically defined behavior and it's very demanding. But that was Tiger. And he became the world's greatest golfer. And so it's really interesting to see that play out.
And I would suspect from your perspective, you would have seen similar patterns in Bezos and Buffett and
Yes.
Bill Gates. And so whether it's Mozart, Einstein, or Edward Van Halen, it would be very, very consistent, whatever the discipline or skill is.
It really is. It really is. And I actually investigated a number of those people and other people who became world-class great. And it's important to do that research because what the outside world sees is only the result. The outside world doesn't see the years of preparation and deliberate practice in whatever form, because it's not good TV, right? Watching someone practice is not riveting. Watching the incredible performance that results is riveting. And so people think that somehow it just happens, but it doesn't.
We're going to turn up the riveting notch. We're going to do what we call the Lipton Pivot survey. It is standard operating procedure here on the Leadership Standard, inspired by the French journalist Bernard Pivot and the host of Inside the Actors Studio, James Lipton. Are you ready, Geoff Colvin?
I'm as ready as I'll ever be,
This
I
is
guess.
rapid fire first response. Here we go. What is your favorite word?
My favorite word, I don't know, serenity.
What is your least favorite word?
This is so hard. What trying to think of a iconic.
What turns you on?
The outdoors.
What turns you off?
Selfishness.
What sound or noise do you love?
Birds singing.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Any loud droning noise.
What is your favorite curse word?
My favorite curse words I won't actually say, but they are very common curse words, far too common, that may begin with a G or a D or even occasionally an F, but I'm afraid they're not very original.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Oh, well, it would be some kind of musician's job, probably playing the violin, since I've played it since I was a boy. It's a little late for me to be pursuing it as a profession, but nonetheless, yes.
What profession, under no circumstances, would you ever want to do?
President of the United States.
Geoff, if heaven does exist, what would you like to hear our Heavenly Father say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You know, I'd just like to hear him say, "You did okay."
Do you have a personal creed or motto that you can share? The 4 or 5 or 7 or 8
Yeah.
words that just define Geoff Colvin and what he's all about.
Yeah. That's really hard. You know, it's really do your best to do what's right.
And as we wrap up this episode of the Leadership Standard, Geoff, what is the number one question that leaders need to be asking right now?
Well, the number one question that business leaders need to be asking right now is how do we make sure that we are still doing well, still doing good things for the world and succeeding at it 5 years from now? And that sounds like a pretty nuts and bolts question, but in light of the world that we live in, it's a really hard question that I think challenges absolutely everybody.
I already know with conviction that so many people have listened from start to finish to this podcast, Geoff. For folks, and we probably have a pretty good feeling that your kids too have watched this whole segment. But for those viewers or listeners who want to connect with you online, what are the best ways and platforms?
Yeah. The easy way to do it is just to go to geoffcolvin.com. And as it said somewhere on a screen, I spelled Geoff kind of funny, Geoff, Colvin, C-O-L-V. So Geoff at geoffcolvin.com will get your email right to me, or just go to geoffcolvin.com and you can find out all sorts of stuff about what I've written and what I've done and so forth, and learn how to get books or anything else like that. It's pretty simple.
Geoff, thank you so much for doing this, and wishing you much continued success.
It's been a great experience, Gair. Thank you very much. This is, I can see why this podcast is very popular, because you do a terrific job. Thanks.
Well, really appreciate having Geoff Colvin, from the senior editor at large at Fortune magazine, best-selling author, global thought leader, joining us here today. And, if you want to know more about Tech Canada and the world-class programs that Tech offers, check out the website, www.tec-canada.com. What was it that Geoff spoke of that made you stop and think? I've got a bunch of notes here. The role of the leader to define reality and offer hope. Love that. The fact that Jeff Bezos is always thinking 2 years in the future, that he's got his people working on the present. But also, Geoff mentioned the core elements of the brand of the future, the ones that are going to win, with clear differentiation, and absolutely clear relevance. So lots to think about here with Geoff Colvin on the Leadership Standard. And hopefully, if you like this program, you'll not only press the like button and subscribe, but you'll also share it and share it widely through your networks so that, who knows, we just might inspire someone else to grab hold of that metaphorical clutch and go full throttle here in the new frontier. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'm Gair Maxwell and hope you enjoyed the Leadership Standard.